0700 hours, June 6th, 1944, Omaha Beach. The first wave of the assault is not assaulting. They are surviving. Pinned down behind steel obstacles, they are being systematically slaughtered by German machine guns nested in the bluffs above. They are waiting, desperately. They are waiting for the armor. The M4 Sherman tanks that were promised. The tanks that were supposed to blast open the exits. The tanks that were supposed to save them. But the tanks are not coming. Out in the channel, the massive landing ship's tank, the LSTs, sit useless. Their bow doors are open, revealing the armored force that could turn the tide. But the beaches of Normandy are a logistical nightmare. They are too shallow. The LSTs have run aground on sandbars, hundreds of yards from dry land. Some tank commanders tried to deploy anyway, driving off the ramps into the deep water. They vanish in seconds, becoming 30-ton steel coffins at the bottom of the English Channel. The infantry on the beach are alone. The most complex military operation in human history, the Great Crusade, is grinding to a halt. It is failing. It is being defeated not by panzers, but by simple geography. Not by a lack of courage, but by a failure of logistics. The entire war hinges on one simple question. How do you bridge the gap? How do you move a 30-ton war machine across 300 feet of open water onto a beach that is being torn apart by artillery? The answer would not come from a 5-star general. It would not come from a soldier on the front line. It came from a quiet engineer in Washington, D.C., whose vital contribution remains one of D-Day's most overlooked stories, and a stupid idea he had built inside a cigar box.
To understand why those tanks were drowning, we must go back 2 years, to 1942. The war was at a tipping point. America was finally in the fight, but a shadow hung over everything: Fortress Europe. Adolf Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile line of concrete bunkers, interlocking machine gun nests, flooded fields, and heavy artillery, designed to make any Allied invasion impossibly costly. But the true strength of this fortress wasn't just the guns, it was the geography. A modern army, the kind needed to defeat the Wehrmacht, does not run on courage. It runs on oil, bullets, bandages, and beans. It runs on heavy equipment, bulldozers to clear roads, artillery to break bunkers, trucks to move supplies, and most importantly, tanks to lead the assault. The only way to unload this ocean of steel, tens of thousands of tons of it, was at a deep-water port, a place like Cherbourg or Le Havre or Calais, a place with reinforced concrete docks, massive industrial cranes, and direct access to the European rail network. The German High Command knew this. They weren't fools. They poured their best troops and their thickest concrete into defending these vital ports. They fortified them into kill boxes, bristling with 15-inch naval guns. They essentially left a sign on the front door that said, "Come and get us." In August of 1942, at the French port of Dieppe, the Allies did just that. The operation was codenamed Jubilee. It was a catastrophe. The landing force, mostly Canadians, was annihilated. The new Churchill tanks that were supposed to support them were stopped cold by the heavy shingle beaches and impenetrable sea walls. They were destroyed before they could even fire an effective shot. Of 6,000 men who went ashore, over 4,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. The lesson was learned in blood. You cannot take a fortified port by sea. It is suicide. This lesson created a strategic paralysis. The Allies were trapped in an impossible loop. They could not defeat the German army in France without landing their own army. They could not land their army without tanks, but they could not land their tanks because the only places to land them were fortresses they could not possibly take. It was a perfect defensive checkmate. So the Allied High Command, led by General Eisenhower and British General Morgan, decided to do the one thing the Germans believed was truly impossible. They would not attack a port at all. They would attack a 50-mile stretch of open, sandy, undefended beach, the shallow, gently sloping holiday beaches of Normandy. It was a brilliant strategic deception. The Germans were so convinced that Calais was the only logical target, they kept their best panzer divisions there, waiting for an invasion that would never come. But this brilliant solution to the strategic problem created a new, even more critical tactical problem. The brand new workhorse of the invasion, the ship that was supposed to make it all possible, was the LST, the landing ship tank. It was a massive ocean-going vessel, over 300 feet long, capable of carrying an entire armored company. It was an engineering marvel, designed by the British and mass-produced by the Americans. Its entire purpose was to run its nose right up onto a beach, open its giant bow doors, and disgorge its cargo of tanks and trucks directly onto dry land. In theory, it was the perfect weapon, but Normandy wasn't a perfect beach. The planners at the new Bureau of Yards and Docks, or B-Docks, studied the tidal charts and reconnaissance photos with growing dread. The Normandy coastline was a logistical nightmare. The beaches were incredibly shallow, with a gentle sloping grade. Worse, they were riddled with hidden sandbars that extended hundreds of yards out to sea. An LST with its deep draft couldn't get anywhere near the dry sand. At high tide, it might get close but would be stranded for hours, a perfect target for artillery. At low tide, it would run aground in 3, 4, or even 5 feet of water. It left a deadly, impassable gap between its ramp and the shore. This single problem threatened to unravel the entire invasion. Other ideas were tried. The DD, or duplex drive tanks, which were given propellers and a canvas flotation screen, were a disaster at Omaha, sinking in the heavy seas. They were too fragile. The Allies now faced the ultimate impossible equation. To win the war, they had to invade France. To invade France, they had to bypass the fortified ports. To bypass the ports, they had to land on the shallow beaches of Normandy. But the shallow beaches of Normandy meant their LSTs couldn't land, which meant their tanks couldn't land. They were stuck. They had solved the strategic problem only to create a fatal tactical one. They were planning the most complex invasion in history, with no way to get their most important weapons ashore. They needed a bridge. Not a bridge over a river, but a temporary floating bridge over an ocean. And the clock was ticking.
The problem landed squarely on the desks of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, known informally as BUDOCs. This was not a place for frontline heroes or grand strategists. It was a place for civil engineers, for architects, for draftsmen. And one of its most brilliant and quietest minds belonged to a civil engineer named Captain John N. Laycock. Laycock was not a general. He was not a warrior. He was by nature a builder. He saw the world not in terms of battles won or lost, but in terms of physics, stress loads, and modular design. He had joined the Navy not to sink ships, but to build the very docks they tied up to. He had been obsessed with a single idea since the 1930s, a standardized modular building block. While other engineers designed custom solutions for every unique problem, Laycock dreamed of a universal one. His invention was simple, a 5 by 7 by 5 foot box of welded steel. It was hollow, it was buoyant, and it was strong enough to hold up a highway bridge. But its true genius was that it was modular. Like a child's toy block, it could be locked together with other blocks using simple steel pins. With these blocks, you could build anything: a pier, a bridge, a floating dry dock. The Navy was impressed, in a purely bureaucratic sort of way. They approved it for rear echelon construction, for building depots in quiet harbors. No one in the Admiralty, no one in the Combat Command saw it as a frontline weapon. It was just a box. But John Laycock saw the Normandy problem differently than anyone else. The generals saw an impassable gap of water. Laycock saw a problem of assembly. The admirals wanted a ship that could drive onto the sand. Laycock realized they didn't need a ship. They just needed a piece of the shore that moved. This is where the legend begins. In early 1943, Laycock was called into a high-level planning meeting. The room was dark, paneled with wood, and full of admirals and generals. They were discussing complex multi-million-dollar solutions: air-dropped tanks, specialized rocket launching barges, the massive, complex floating harbors that would become known as the mulberries. The room was thick with skepticism. None of these ideas seemed fast enough or reliable enough. Then Captain Laycock spoke. He, a civil engineer, proposed his solution. He didn't have complex schematics. He didn't have a naval architect's presentation. Instead, according to the historical record, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a simple, crude model he had built himself. A model made from a cigar box. He placed the cigar box on the polished table in front of the admirals. He explained that his pontoon blocks could be assembled at sea. They could be locked together, side by side and end to end, to form a massive, flat, floating platform. It wouldn't be elegant. It would just be a giant steel raft. The officers were not impressed. It was crude. It was slow. It was a box. "And how, Captain," one of them likely asked, "do you propose to move this box?" This is where Laycock's idea connected with another secret weapon the Navy was building: the Seabees. The Naval Construction Battalions, or Seabees, were a new kind of military unit, a direct reflection of American industrial power. They were not sailors. They were 40-year-old Union men, welders, bulldozer operators, and iron workers given a uniform and a gun. Their average age was 37. Their motto was, "We build, we fight." They were the toughest construction crews on Earth. Laycock's plan was simple. You give my blocks to the Seabees. The idea was this: load the LSTs not just with tanks, but with stacks of these flat-packed pontoon blocks. When the LSTs anchor offshore, the Seabees hit the water. They work under fire, in the freezing surf, assembling these blocks like the world's most dangerous Lego set. They would build massive 150-foot-long barges right there in the middle of the battle. Then came the stupid part, the part that made naval traditionalists wince. How do you power it? You don't. Not with a complex internal engine. You take 2 or 4 or sometimes 6 massive outboard motors, the kind you'd see on a high-speed boat, and you simply bolt them to the back. The admirals were appalled. It was an insult to ship design. It was a floating slab of steel powered by boat motors, steered by a simple tiller. It was loud. It was undefended. It was, by all estimations, a coffin corner for its crew. The men who drove them gave it a nickname, a perfect name for a machine so ugly and powerful: the Rhino Ferry. It was, on paper, a terrible idea. It was slow,
topping out at just 4 knots. It was a massive target, and it was being operated by men who were builders, not sailors. But it had one single war-winning advantage. It was a barge that was 150 feet long, but its draft, the amount of water it needed to float, was almost nothing. It could glide right over the sandbars. With the invasion clock ticking and no other solution on the table, the admirals, still skeptical, gave the order: build them. They would be tested not in the safety of a Virginia harbor, but in the middle of the next major invasion. The cigar-box idea was going to war.
The test would not be a drill. It would be a full-scale invasion. Operation Husky, the Allied landing in Sicily, July 1943. Sicily was the soft underbelly of Europe, and General George S. Patton was tasked with breaking it open. But the beaches of Sicily presented the exact same problem as Normandy: shallow, sloping, and impossible for LSTs to reach. The Rhino Ferry program, born from Laycock's concept and now in the hands of the Seabees, was ordered into its first combat test. The men of the naval construction battalions were told to prepare the components for shipment, but they had no idea what to expect. They were welders and mechanics, not assault troops. Now they were being told they would be among the first to hit the beaches, driving a 150-foot-long, unarmored barge that had never been tried in combat. The night of the invasion, July 10, 1943, a severe storm blew in. A 5-foot surf smashed against the invasion fleet. The entire operation was in chaos. Aboard the LSTs, soldiers and Seabees were violently ill. But as the bow doors of the ships opened at 0200 hours, the Seabees got to work. Under enemy fire, tossed by high waves, they began assembling Laycock's pontoons. They were building their own lifeboats in the middle of a shipwreck. One LST, number 389, was hit by the waves so hard its ramp chains snapped, leaving the bow doors jammed open. But the Seabees kept working. As dawn broke, the moment of truth arrived. The LSTs, just as predicted, grounded hundreds of yards from shore. The infantry waded through deep, chest-high water, but the tanks were stuck. Patton's armor was trapped on its ships. Then, through the smoke, came the sound, a chugging, deafening roar of high-powered motors. It was the Rhino Ferries. Manned by Seabee crews, these massive steel rafts, these floating coffins, ignored the high surf and pushed straight towards the stranded LSTs. Aboard one LST, a young, skeptical tank commander watched as this thing, this flat piece of floating junk, maneuvered against his ship's ramp. A Seabee, drenched and grinning, waved him on. The commander held his breath, gunned his engine, and drove his 30-ton Sherman tank onto the raft. The Rhino barely dipped. It held. Then the Seabee crews steered the barge, loaded with tanks and trucks, straight through the waves, gliding over the shallow sandbars that had crippled the LSTs. It ran its flat nose directly onto the dry sand of the beach. The Sherman drove off and immediately went into action. It was a miracle. Throughout the day, these ugly, stupid barges became the single most important weapon of the invasion. They were the only things that worked. According to a Seabee report, they worked non-stop. When one LST was bombed and set ablaze, a Seabee crew driving a Rhino ferry saw it. Under fire, they maneuvered their barge between the burning ship and another vessel, creating a makeshift bridge. Between 150 and 200 Allied soldiers, trapped by the flames, raced across the Seabees pontoon barge to safety. They weren't just moving tanks, they were saving lives. The Sicily invasion was secured. The Rhino Ferry was no longer a stupid idea. It was now the only proven solution to the problem that had haunted Allied planners for years. When General Eisenhower began planning the Normandy invasion, he knew the shallow beaches would be a death trap without armor. He needed the rhinos. But there was a new problem. This time, the Seabees wouldn't be able to assemble the pontoons at sea under the intense fire of the Atlantic Wall. The ferries had to be pre-built. So, in the months leading up to D-Day, a massive secret construction project began in the ports of southern England. The Seabees, along with British Royal Engineers, began assembling hundreds of Laycock's pontoons. This time, they made them even bigger. They created massive Rhino ferries, many of them formed by 30 pontoons long and 6 wide. They were nearly 200 feet long and displaced 275 tons and could carry a staggering payload. But they were still, fundamentally, just flat rafts with motors bolted on. The plan was simple. The LSTs would carry the infantry and tanks. Towed behind them, like a humble afterthought, would be the Rhino ferries. When the LSTs inevitably got stuck on the Normandy sandbars, the tanks and trucks would drive out of the LST onto the Rhino, and the Seabee crew would then drive the ferry the final deadly distance to the beach. The quiet engineer's cigar-box was now the linchpin for the entire invasion of Europe. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Operation Overlord is underway. Just as the planners had feared, the LSTs approaching Omaha and Utah beaches hit the sandbars and ground to a halt hundreds of yards from shore. The complex, multi-million-dollar Mulberry harbors, massive prefabricated ports towed across the channel, were still being assembled. They would not be operational for days. The infantry was trapped. The armored divisions were stuck at sea. The entire invasion was failing. Then they came. Manned by the men of the 25th and 111th Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees, the Rhino ferries began their charge. These were not assault troops. They were welders, mechanics, and heavy equipment operators, and they were now steering 150-foot steel barges straight into the teeth of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. They had no armor. They had no cover. They were, according to one historian, the largest, slowest-moving targets on the English Channel. German artillery spotters on the bluffs were stunned. They didn't know what they were seeing, but it was big and it was moving. They directed their 88mm guns on to the barges. Shells rained down. The water around the ferries erupted in massive columns. Machine gun fire raked their steel decks. But the Seabees didn't stop. They maneuvered their clumsy, stupid barges right up to the bow ramps of the stranded LSTs. Tank commanders, who had been watching the slaughter on the beach, now drove their 30-ton Shermans onto the rafts. The Rhinos took the weight, their decks sinking perilously close to the water, but they held. Then the Seabee coxswain would turn the barge, open the throttles on the outboard motors, and begin the long, agonizing crawl toward the shore. They were fighting a war of logistics under main battle conditions. When a mortar shell killed a Seabee at the tiller, another would take his place. When shrapnel tore through the fuel lines of an engine, a mechanic would hang off the back, exposed to fire, trying to patch it. At Omaha and Utah beaches,
All through that first critical day and the next, these ferries were the only significant lifeline. They were the only system that could bridge the gap from ship to shore. They carried the tanks that finally broke the stalemate at exit D1 on Omaha. They carried the bulldozers that began clearing the obstacles. They carried the ambulances that would evacuate the wounded. This was John Laycock's cigar-box idea, fully realized. It wasn't a complex, elegant ship. It was a crude, brutal, effective tool manned by construction workers. And in those first 48 hours, as the fate of the world hung in the balance, it was this simple, overlooked, and stupid invention that delivered the steel fist of the Allied armies and saved the D-Day invasion.
When the beaches were finally secured, the war correspondents and the history writers arrived. They looked for the story, and their eyes were drawn to the spectacular. They wrote about the mulberry harbors, the massive prefabricated ports that were towed across the channel. They were an engineering marvel, a testament to Allied ingenuity. They became the symbol of D-Day's logistical triumph. They wrote about the Higgins boat, the small LCVP that carried men onto the beaches. General Eisenhower himself would later say that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us, because without his boats, the landings would have been impossible. But in the shadow of these two great stories, the Rhino Ferry was overlooked. It was too simple. It was too ugly. It was just a raft. Its contribution was reduced to a footnote. But a footnote that holds a crucial truth. The Higgins boat carried the soldier. The Mulberry Harbor supplied the army after the beachhead was won. But the Rhino Ferry, it carried the tank. And in those first 48 hours, when the infantry was being torn apart, it was the tank that mattered most. The Rhino was the missing link. It was the bridge, not to the victory, but the bridge that made the victory possible. History forgot the ferry, and it forgot the men who conceived it and the men who drove it. Captain John N. Laycock returned to his work at the Bureau of Yards and Docks. He was a builder, not a self-promoter. He had solved the problem, and that was enough. There would be no parades for him. His name would not appear in the headlines. His simple, brilliant cigar box model would be packed away, his contribution buried in engineering reports. And the Seabees, the men of the 25th and 111th Construction Battalions, they simply went back to work. When the beaches were stable, they put down their tillers and picked up their bulldozers and welding torches. They built the airfields, paved the roads, and cleared the harbors that allowed the Allied army to finally push toward Berlin. They never asked for credit. They were, as their motto said, the can-do men. They were given an impossible job with a tool that shouldn't have worked in a place they shouldn't have been, and they just did it. The Rhino ferries, their job done, were eventually pushed onto the beaches and abandoned. Today, their rusted skeletons still lie half-buried in the sands of Normandy, mistaken by tourists for just another piece of wreckage. They are the quiet, forgotten monuments to the most important and most overlooked logistical victory of D-Day.
The Second World War was not just a war of grand strategies and heroic charges. It was a war of industry, of logistics, of simple, brutal math. It was won by men like John Laycock, the quiet engineers who saw a deadly equation and solved it with the tools they had. It was won by the Seabees, the welders and the mechanics who took a stupid idea and drove it straight into hell because the job had to get done. The story of the Rhino Ferry is a powerful reminder. History is often built on solutions that are not elegant. They are not beautiful. They are crude. They are ugly. And they are overlooked. But they work.
While the grand complex mulberry harbors were being assembled, it was the cigar-box raft that bridged the most critical gap in the invasion. It proved that in a moment of crisis, adaptability will always defeat doctrine. And a good, simple idea in the hands of brave men can change the world. So the next time you look at the iconic photos of D-Day, look past the LCVPs and the chaos. Look for the massive, flat, ugly barges sitting low in the water, carrying the tanks. They are the unsung heroes of the landing, the stupid idea that worked. What other overlooked inventions or forgotten heroes of D-Day do you think deserve to be remembered? Tell us their stories in the comments below.